The avoidant person operates with deeply embedded belief that they're fundamentally different from and superior to other people, particularly to those who demonstrate emotional needs, desire for connection, or vulnerability in relationships. This sense of specialness is not based on genuine exceptional qualities or achievements. It's defensive delusion constructed to protect their ego from the reality of their emotional limitations and relational dysfunction. The avoidant person looks at people who pursue relationships, who express their needs openly, who want commitment and intimacy, and they see weakness, neediness, desperation, lack of sophistication. They see themselves as having transcended these base human needs, as being more evolved, more independent, more rational, more complex than the common masses who seem to require connection and validation from others. This perception of specialness manifests in subtle and not so subtle ways. The dismissive tone when discussing others' relationship needs, the pride in their ability to be alone, the framing of their emotional unavailability as depth and complexity that others can't understand, the belief that their patterns reflect choice and strength rather than fear and limitation. They genuinely believe they're operating on a different level, that their detachment is sophistication, that their inability to sustain intimacy is evidence of being too evolved for conventional relationships, that their defensive patterns are preferences that make them unique rather than wounds that make them unavailable. This delusion serves crucial psychological function. It allows the avoidant person to avoid confronting the painful truth that their patterns stem from childhood wounds and attachment trauma, that their independence is compulsive rather than chosen, that their emotional disconnection is limitation rather than strength, that they're not special or superior, but rather wounded in ways that prevent them from experiencing the intimacy that most humans need and want. The specialness narrative protects them from shame, from grief, from the work of healing, and from the vulnerability of acknowledging that they struggle with something fundamental that others can do more easily. But this delusion comes at enormous cost, preventing genuine self-awareness, meaningful connection, and the possibility of healing and growth. The superiority complex, built on emotional disconnection. The foundation of the avoidant person's sense of specialness is their interpretation of their own emotional disconnection and self-sufficiency as evidence of superiority, rather than as manifestation of attachment wounds and defensive patterns. They look at their ability to function without close emotional bonds, their comfort with being alone, their lack of apparent need for others, and they see strength, evolution, enlightenment. They compare themselves to people who seem to need relationships, who pursue connection actively, who express vulnerability and emotional needs, and they feel superior to these people who appear weak or dependent in comparison to their own self-contained independence. This superiority complex manifests in how avoidants think about and discuss emotional expression and needs. They view people who cry, who express hurt or sadness, who ask for comfort or support, as being overly emotional, too sensitive, unable to regulate themselves. They pride themselves on their own stoicism, their ability to handle difficulties without breaking down, their capacity to remain calm and rational when others become emotional. This pride is deeply misguided because emotional expression is not weakness and emotional suppression is not strength. The ability to access and express emotions appropriately is actually a marker of emotional health and intelligence, while chronic disconnection from emotions is limitation. But the avoidant person has inverted this reality, convincing themselves that their emotional limitation is sophisticated control. The avoidant person's superiority complex also appears in how they view people who desire committed relationships, who want to build lives with partners, who seek intimacy and connection as primary goals. The avoidant sees these desires as needy, conventional, lacking imagination, or independence. They see themselves as transcending such pedestrian needs, as being satisfied with their own company, as not requiring validation or partnership from others. They frame their patterns as conscious choice to prioritize other things, freedom and independence and personal growth, over the trap of conventional relationships. This framing allows them to feel superior to people who settle for traditional partnership, who need someone else to feel complete, who depend on relationships for happiness. The intellectual component of the avoidant superiority complex is particularly pronounced. Many avoidants are genuinely intelligent and use their intellectual capacity to construct elaborate rationalizations for their patterns that make those patterns seem like sophisticated life philosophy rather than defensive dysfunction. They read about attachment theory and use it to justify their avoidance rather than to motivate change. They adopt philosophies about independence and self-sufficiency that validate their patterns. They intellectualize their emotions in ways that make emotional disconnection seem like higher-order thinking. This intellectual framework makes them feel not just different, but better, more thoughtful, more self-aware, more evolved than people who simply pursue relationships without all this analytical complexity. The avoidant person often displays condescension toward anxious attachment patterns specifically, viewing anxiously attached people as particularly weak or pathetic in their need for reassurance and closeness. The avoidant sees the anxious person's pursuit, their expressions of insecurity, their need for frequent contact and validation, and feels both repelled and superior. They cannot understand why someone would debase themselves through such obvious need, why someone would tolerate the anxiety that relationships create for anxiously attached people. The avoidant's own strategy of avoiding the anxiety through disconnection seems clearly superior to the anxious person's strategy of seeking reassurance, and this comparison reinforces the avoidant's belief in their own specialness. This superiority complex also manifests in the avoidant person's belief that they see through social constructs and expectations that others blindly follow. They believe they've recognized that the conventional relationship script, the progression toward commitment and marriage and building shared life, is cultural programming that people follow without questioning whether it actually serves them. The avoidant sees themselves as having questioned these constructs and chosen differently, as being free-thinking and independent, where others are conformist and conventional. This perception makes them feel intellectually and psychologically superior, more aware, more authentic in their choices, even though their choices are actually driven by unconscious fear and defensive patterns, rather than by conscious examination of what would truly serve their well-being and fulfillment. The avoidant's sense of specialness is also built on their belief that they're more self-aware than others because they've identified their attachment pattern and can articulate it. Many avoidants who learn about attachment theory develop sophisticated understanding of their patterns and can discuss them intelligently. But this intellectual awareness exists alongside complete lack of emotional integration or behavioral change. The avoidant mistakes their ability to name and describe their patterns for actual self-awareness and growth, feeling superior to people who don't have the language to describe their attachment patterns, even though those people might have more genuine emotional awareness and capacity for growth than the intellectualizing avoidant. The superiority complex ultimately rests on fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes strength, health, and sophistication in human relationships. The avoidant has internalized belief system where independence is always superior to interdependence, where emotional control is always superior to emotional expression, where being alone is always superior to being connected, where complexity is always superior to simplicity, where detachment is always superior to engagement. These beliefs invert the reality that healthy adult functioning includes capacity for both autonomy and intimacy, that emotional expression within appropriate context is healthy, that genuine partnership enhances rather than diminishes individual lives, and that the simplicity of wanting connection is more honest and healthy than the complex defensive structures built to avoid it. But acknowledging these truths would require the avoidant to confront that their patterns are limitations rather than strengths, and this confrontation threatens the entire edifice of specialness they've constructed to protect their ego. How they mistake dysfunction for sophistication. The avoidant person's sense of specialness is heavily reinforced by their consistent pattern of mistaking their dysfunction for sophistication, interpreting their limitations and defensive patterns as evidence of complexity, depth, and evolved consciousness that others lack. This fundamental misinterpretation allows them to maintain their superiority complex even while their patterns consistently prevent them from achieving the intimacy and fulfillment that healthy relationships provide. Understanding how this misinterpretation operates reveals both the psychological mechanisms protecting the avoidance ego and the profound delusion at the heart of their self-perception. The avoidant person interprets their emotional unavailability as emotional depth and complexity that others cannot understand or access. When they struggle to express feelings, when they remain distant or detached in situations that call for emotional presence, when they cannot articulate what they're experiencing internally, they frame this as being too complex or too deep for simple emotional expression. They tell themselves and others that their feelings are too nuanced, too layered, too sophisticated to be reduced to words or shared openly. They believe that people who can easily express love or vulnerability are feeling simpler, more surface-level emotions, while their own emotional complexity requires privacy and cannot be communicated. This interpretation allows them to feel superior about their emotional limitation, to view their inability to connect emotionally as evidence of having richer internal life than people who connect more easily. The reality is precisely the opposite. Emotional sophistication includes the ability to access, understand, and appropriately communicate emotions. The capacity for emotional expression and vulnerability is marker of emotional intelligence and maturity. The avoidant person's difficulty with emotional expression typically stems not from having feelings that are too complex to share, but from having suppressed their emotional access so thoroughly that they genuinely struggle to know what they feel, or from being too afraid of vulnerability to share feelings they do recognize. Their emotional unavailability is limitation, not sophistication, but they've constructed an elaborate narrative that interprets the limitation as its opposite. The avoidant person also mistakes their pattern of maintaining distance and independence for healthy boundaries and self-preservation. They interpret their refusal to merge lives with partners, their insistence on maintaining separate spaces and schedules, their resistance to building shared future, as wise protection of their autonomy and identity. They view people who naturally move toward integration and interdependence in relationships as losing themselves, as becoming codependent, as failing to maintain healthy sense of self. The avoidant sees their own rigid maintenance of separation as sophisticated understanding of how to preserve individuality within relationship, as refusing to make the mistakes that others make of becoming too enmeshed or dependent. The reality is that healthy relationships include both autonomy and intimacy, both individual identity and shared identity, both independence and interdependence. The capacity to maintain sense of self while also building genuine partnership is sophisticated. The avoidant person's rigid insistence on extreme independence and separation is not sophisticated boundary setting, but rather defensive prevention of genuine intimacy. They're not wisely protecting their autonomy, but rather compulsively avoiding the vulnerability that sharing life with someone requires. But interpreting their pattern as sophisticated allows them to avoid confronting that it's driven by fear rather than by wisdom. The avoidant mistakes their inability to commit for having high standards and refusing to settle. When they struggle to commit to relationships, when they always find reasons why this person isn't quite right or why this timing isn't perfect, when they maintain perpetual uncertainty about whether they want to continue or leave, they interpret this as being discerning and refusing to accept less than they deserve. They see people who commit more easily as settling, as being less choosy, as not having the standards or self-respect to hold out for something truly exceptional. The avoidant's inability to commit to anyone, regardless of how compatible or wonderful that person might be, is reframed as evidence that they're waiting for something truly special, rather than evidence that their defensive patterns prevent commitment regardless of the partner's qualities. The reality is that the avoidant person's commitment difficulties have little to do with the partner's qualities and everything to do with their own discomfort, with the vulnerability that commitment requires. They would struggle to commit to any partner once the relationship reached depth that triggered their defenses, but they interpret their consistent pattern of finding reasons not to commit as being appropriately selective rather than as being defensively avoidant. The sophisticated approach to commitment involves assessing compatibility and choosing to commit when genuine compatibility exists, accepting that no partner will be perfect, but that good enough partnership with someone compatible is valuable. The avoidance pattern of perpetual uncommitted uncertainty is dysfunction, not sophistication. The avoidant person interprets their hot and cold behavior, their push-pull dynamic, their inconsistency as complexity and depth, rather than as defensive ambivalence. When they're warm, one day, and cold the next. When they pursue when you pull back and retreat when you're available. When they send mixed signals that keep partners confused and off balance, they see this as reflecting their complex internal experience, their need for both connection and space, their sophisticated ability to honor their changing needs. They might frame it as honoring their authentic feelings moment to moment, rather than performing consistency for others' comfort. They see their inconsistency as refusing to be boxed in by others' expectations, as being true to themselves even when that truth is complicated. The reality is that the push-pull dynamic reflects the avoidant person's internal conflict between their attachment needs and their fear of intimacy, and healthy resolution of this conflict involves working to increase capacity for sustained closeness rather than inflicting the conflict on partners through inconsistent behavior. The sophisticated approach involves communicating about internal conflict and working to resolve it rather than simply acting it out through confusing behavior. The avoidance pattern of inconsistency is dysfunction that harms relationships, not sophisticated authenticity. The avoidant mistakes their intellectualization and analysis for self-awareness and psychological sophistication. They analyze their relationships extensively, dissect their patterns, discuss attachment theory with impressive vocabulary. But this intellectual engagement exists without emotional integration or behavioral change. They believe that understanding their patterns intellectually is the same as doing the work to heal them, that being able to name and describe their avoidance is sophisticated self-awareness. They feel superior to people who might be more emotionally aware, but who lack the intellectual framework to discuss attachment patterns in theoretical terms. The reality is that genuine self-awareness includes both intellectual understanding and emotional access, both being able to name patterns and being able to feel and work with the emotions underneath those patterns. The avoidance intellectualization without emotional integration is actually a defense mechanism that allows them to think about their patterns without feeling them, to discuss their dysfunction without changing it. True psychological sophistication includes the willingness to do uncomfortable work of actually changing defensive patterns once you've identified them, not just analyzing them endlessly while continuing to enact them. The delusion that independence equals enlightenment. Perhaps the most fundamental delusion in the avoidant person's sense of specialness is their belief that their independence, their self-sufficiency, their ability to function without close relationships represents some form of enlightenment or evolved consciousness that transcends the common human need for connection. This belief is central to their identity and their sense of being different from and superior to others. Understanding this delusion and the reality it obscures is essential for grasping both the depth of the avoidant self-deception and the psychological function this delusion serves. The avoidant person interprets their lack of need for close relationships as spiritual or psychological evolution beyond attachment and dependence. They see themselves as having transcended the base human need for connection that still binds less evolved individuals. They view their comfort with solitude, their ability to be alone for extended periods without loneliness or longing, their lack of apparent need for intimate partnership as evidence that they've achieved state of self-completion that others struggle toward but rarely achieve. They might reference philosophical or spiritual traditions that emphasize detachment and non-attachment, interpreting their own emotional disconnection as the detachment these traditions describe. This interpretation represents fundamental misunderstanding of both healthy human psychology and the spiritual concepts they're appropriating. Humans are social creatures whose well-being depends on connection and relationship. The capacity for healthy attachment and interdependence is not something to transcend, but rather something to develop and maintain. The spiritual concept of non-attachment refers to not clinging desperately to outcomes or to impermanent things, not to disconnecting from relationships or refusing to form meaningful bonds. The avoidant person's emotional disconnection is not enlightened non-attachment, but rather defensive avoidance rooted in fear and childhood wounds. But interpreting their pattern as enlightenment allows them to feel superior and special, rather than wounded and limited. The avoidant person believes their independence means they're complete within themselves, that they've achieved self-actualization that makes external relationships optional rather than necessary. They see people who seek relationships, who want partners, who desire intimacy, as being incomplete and seeking completion through others. The avoidant views this seeking as weakness or lack of self-development, evidence that these people haven't done the work of becoming whole within themselves. The avoidant believes they have done this work, that they've become so complete and self-sufficient that they don't need anyone else, and this completion is evidence of their superior development. This belief misunderstands the relationship between independence and wholeness. Healthy adults are complete within themselves and capable of deep connection with others. Wholeness includes the capacity for both autonomy and intimacy, not the elimination of need for connection in favor of complete independence. The avoidant person's rigid independence is not evidence of self-completion, but rather evidence of defensive protection against the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. Someone who is genuinely whole and self-actualized doesn't fear connection or avoid intimacy. They engage in relationships from place of fullness rather than from need, but they still value and pursue connection because connection is fundamental human need and source of meaning and fulfillment. The avoidant interprets their lack of loneliness or their comfort with being alone as evidence that they've transcended the human need for belonging and connection. When they hear others express loneliness or desire for partnership, they feel superior because they don't experience these feelings to the same degree or at all. They believe this absence of loneliness means they're more evolved, more self-sufficient, more psychologically healthy than people who struggle with being alone. They might pride themselves on being able to go weeks or months without meaningful social connection and still feel fine, interpreting this as strength. The reality is that the avoidant person's lack of loneliness often reflects their emotional suppression and disconnection rather than genuine fulfillment in solitude. Many avoidants have suppressed their attachment needs so thoroughly that they don't consciously access the loneliness or longing that would be natural responses to isolation. They've trained themselves not to need, not to want, not to miss connection, and they interpret this training as having transcended need rather than as having buried it. Some avoidants do experience loneliness, but interpret it as weakness and suppress it, while others genuinely don't feel it because they've become so disconnected from their attachment system. Neither pattern represents enlightenment or superior development. The avoidant person often views relationships as distractions from more important pursuits, as obligations that would interfere with their focus on career, creative work, personal development, or other individual goals. They believe that people who prioritize relationships over these pursuits have misplaced priorities, that intimate partnerships drain time and energy that could be better invested in individual achievement or growth. The avoidant sees their own prioritization of individual pursuits over relationships as evidence of superior values and focus, of refusing to be distracted by the relationship drama that consumes less disciplined or less evolved people. This interpretation ignores that healthy humans can and do balance meaningful relationships with individual pursuits, that relationships enhance rather than detract from well-being, and that isolation in service of achievement often leads to emptiness rather than fulfillment. The avoidance framing of relationships as distractions is defensive rationalization that justifies their avoidance patterns by making those patterns seem like wise choices rather than fear-driven compulsions. Many of history's most accomplished and fulfilled people maintain deep, intimate relationships alongside their achievements, and research consistently shows that close relationships are one of the most significant contributors to human happiness and well-being across the lifespan. The avoidant person believes that their ability to function independently, to handle life's challenges without support from others, to solve their own problems without asking for help, demonstrates superior strength and capability. They view people who reach out for support, who ask for help, who depend on others during difficult times, as weak or inadequate. The avoidant prides themselves on handling everything alone, on never burdening others, on being completely self-reliant. They interpret this as evidence of their exceptional capacity and strength. The reality is that the ability to appropriately seek and accept support is strength, not weakness. Healthy interdependence includes knowing when you need help and being willing to ask for and receive it. The avoidance compulsive self-reliance is not superior strength, but rather defensive pattern that prevents them from experiencing the support and care that make difficult times more manageable and that create deeper bonds through mutual care and vulnerability. Their refusal to ask for help often makes their life harder than it needs to be and prevents others from feeling needed and valued in relationship with them. What shatters? Their illusion of being above everyone else. The avoidant person's carefully constructed sense of specialness, their delusion of superiority, is not infinitely sustainable. Specific experiences and realizations can shatter this illusion, forcing the avoidant to confront the reality that their patterns are limitations rather than strengths, that they're wounded rather than evolved, that they're missing out on fundamental human experiences rather than transcending them. Understanding what shatters the illusion illuminates both the fragility of the avoidance defensive structure and the potential pathways toward genuine self-awareness and growth. The first experience that can shatter the illusion is the accumulation of failed relationships and the eventual inability to deny the pattern. When the avoidant person is young, they can easily explain away individual relationship failures through focusing on specific incompatibilities or circumstances. But as they age and the pattern repeats across multiple relationships with different people, the common factor becomes undeniable. They are the consistent variable. Every relationship follows similar trajectory: initial connection, increasing closeness that triggers anxiety, withdrawal, and creation of distance, eventual ending. When this pattern has repeated 5, 10, 15 times, when they look back and see the trail of people they pushed away or couldn't commit to, when they recognize that the problems weren't unique to each person, but rather reflected their own consistent responses, the illusion that they're choosing wisely or that they simply haven't found the right person becomes harder to maintain. This recognition is particularly powerful if the avoidant person can acknowledge that some of the people they pushed away were genuinely compatible, genuinely healthy, genuinely good partners who would have been excellent matches if the avoidant could have sustained intimacy with them. When they're honest enough to admit that the problem wasn't the other person's inadequacy, but rather their own patterns, the superiority complex begins to crack. They're forced to confront that they're not special or enlightened, but rather stuck in defensive pattern that prevents them from maintaining the relationships they might actually want. The second shattering experience is watching others build the lives and relationships that the avoidant claims not to want, while recognizing their own loneliness or emptiness. The avoidant person tells themselves they don't need or want traditional relationships, that they're satisfied with their independence, that they're pursuing more important things. But as they age and watch friends and peers build partnerships, create families, develop deep, intimate bonds that provide support and meaning, the avoidant might begin to recognize what they're missing. The loneliness they've been suppressing or denying might become harder to ignore. The emptiness of their isolated life might become more apparent. The realization that they have no one to share their experiences with, no one who truly knows them, no deep connections that provide meaning and support, can force recognition that their independence is not as fulfilling as they've been telling themselves. This recognition is particularly powerful when the avoidant experiences crisis or difficulty that highlights the absence of support system that intimate relationships provide. When they face health issue, job loss, family crisis, or other significant challenge and have no one to turn to, no one who's invested enough to support them through difficulty, they might recognize that their independent self-sufficiency has left them genuinely alone in ways that are not strengths, but rather vulnerabilities. The illusion that they don't need anyone shatters against the reality of human interdependence and the genuine value of having people who care deeply enough to show up during difficult times. The third experience that shatters the illusion is encountering someone who displays genuine emotional health and maturity that highlights the avoidant's limitations by contrast. When the avoidant meets someone who is emotionally available, who can be both autonomous and intimate, who expresses feelings appropriately, who maintains healthy relationships, who seems genuinely fulfilled and at peace, the avoidant's defensive framework is challenged. They might initially try to find flaws in this person or to dismiss them as conventional or simple. But if they're honest, they might recognize that this person possesses capacities they lack, that this person's emotional availability is strength rather than weakness, that this person's ability to maintain intimate relationships reflects health rather than neediness. This recognition can be particularly powerful if the emotionally healthy person demonstrates clear boundaries and self-respect that contradict the avoidant's belief that people who desire relationships are desperate or lacking in standards. When they see someone who wants relationship but who won't tolerate poor treatment, who values connection but who also values themselves, who pursues intimacy from place of fullness rather than from neediness, the avoidance framework, that equates desire for relationship with weakness becomes untenable. They're forced to recognize that their own patterns might reflect fear and limitation rather than superior evolution. The fourth, shattering experience is the loss of someone truly important that forces the avoidant to confront that they do have attachment needs and that losing people does hurt them. The avoidant person has constructed identity around not needing anyone, not being affected deeply by loss, being able to move on easily. But when they lose someone who mattered more than they allowed themselves to acknowledge, when they experience grief that they cannot suppress or intellectualize away, when they're forced to sit with the reality that this person was important and that losing them is genuinely painful, their entire narrative about their independence and emotional invulnerability is challenged. They discover that they do have the attachment needs they believe they transcended, that they are affected by connection and loss, just like everyone else, that their specialness was defensive fiction rather than reality. The fifth experience that can shatter the illusion is honest self-reflection, possibly prompted by therapy or by life circumstances that force them to examine their patterns. If the avoidant person develops genuine willingness to look honestly at their life, their relationships, their emotional patterns, and the gap between the life they're living and the fulfillment they actually experience, they might recognize that their defensive narratives are not serving them. They might acknowledge that their independence is lonely rather than freeing, that their emotional disconnection is limitation rather than sophistication, that their pattern of avoiding intimacy has cost them meaningful relationships and experiences. This honest self-reflection requires tremendous courage because it means dismantling the protective illusions that have shielded their ego from painful truths about their wounds and limitations. The sixth shattering experience is aging and recognizing the trajectory they're on if patterns don't change. The avoidant person in their 20s or 30s can still maintain illusions about their choices and their future. But as they move into their 40s, 50s, and beyond, the reality of their likely future becomes clearer. If they continue their patterns, they will likely age alone, without intimate partnership, without the deep bonds that provide meaning and support in later life. The research on aging and well-being consistently shows that close relationships are among the most important factors in healthy, fulfilling aging, and that isolation is a significant risk factor for both physical and mental health decline. The avoidant person who recognizes this trajectory, who sees themselves 20 or 30 years in the future, still alone, still maintaining their independence, still protecting themselves from intimacy, might begin to question whether their patterns are serving them or whether they're on path toward loneliness and regret. When the illusion shatters, when the avoidant person is forced to confront that they're not special or superior, but rather wounded and limited, several outcomes are possible. Some avoidants will quickly rebuild the defensive illusions, finding new ways to justify their patterns and maintain their sense of specialness, despite the contradictory evidence. They cannot tolerate the shame and grief that honest self-recognition would trigger, so they retreat back into delusion. Other avoidants will acknowledge their patterns intellectually while still not changing behaviorally, adding layer of self-awareness to their defensive structure without actually doing the work of healing. They know they're avoidant, they can discuss it intelligently, but they continue enacting the same patterns. But some avoidants, when the illusion shatters, can use that recognition as catalyst for genuine change. They can acknowledge that they're not special or enlightened, but rather wounded in ways that have prevented them from experiencing the intimacy and connection that humans need. They can grieve what they've lost through their patterns and what they missed in childhood that created those patterns. They can commit to the difficult work of therapy and healing that addresses attachment wounds at their roots. They can practice vulnerability and closeness despite the anxiety these create. They can build capacity for sustained intimacy rather than continuing to avoid it. This path is difficult and uncomfortable, requiring them to abandon the protective specialness narrative and sit with the reality of their limitations. But it's the only path that leads to genuine healing, to the capacity for intimate relationship, to the fulfillment that comes from connection, rather than from defensive isolation. The question is whether the avoidant person, once their illusion is shattered, can tolerate the discomfort of growth, or whether they will retreat back into the familiar delusion that their dysfunction is sophistication and their limitation is strength.